Welcome, everyone, to Trails Worth Hiking, the show that brings you some of the most amazing backpacking and trekking routes in the world. I'm your host, Jeremy Pendry. In the first part of the show, we bring you the story and history of a trail. Then we tell you what it's like to hike the trail and how you can do it. On this episode, we go to the Riviera. It's always nice to go to the beach, right? But this isn't southern France. This is the Riviera of the Sierra, the Benson Riviera. Deep in a remote corner of the Sierra Nevada mountains, in a lightly traveled part of Yosemite National Park, at more than 7,500 feet in altitude, is Benson Lake. And unlike any other Sierra Nevada lake I've seen, Benson Lake has a phenomenal beach. In fact, it's so big, you camp right on the beach. Yep, beach camping in the middle of the mountains. You really have to see it to believe it. On this episode of Trails Worth Hiking, we travel the Benson Lake Loop in the Sierra Nevada mountains of California. In September 2018, my daughter Sonia and I drove to Bridgeport, California in the Eastern Sierra and stayed in the Redwood Motel, which is a kitschy little motel probably built in the 50s. It has a statue of a cow in a Hawaiian shirt out in front. We stayed there for the evening, and then the next day we drove up to Twin Lakes and began our hike along the Benson Lake Loop. In October 2020, in the height of the pandemic, I went back to Bridgeport with my wife and my son, and we stayed a week. We were looking for a change of scenery. We had been quarantined in our home for months, me working, my wife teaching first grade over Zoom, and my son attending his senior year in high school by Zoom, and we thought it'd be a nice change of scenery to spend some time in Bridgeport. What is Bridgeport? Bridgeport is a small town at over 6,000 feet in altitude along Highway 395 near the Walker River. It's in the Eastern Sierra. You have to climb Sonora Pass or Tioga Pass across the Sierra to get to it. And when you arrive, you're in an area that's surrounded by high desert, but the valley that Bridgeport is in looks pretty fertile. It has grass and cattle, and it's a sort of oasis in the eastern high desert of the beginnings of the Great Basin Desert that stretches from the far east of California all the way across Nevada and beyond. There's a reservoir next to Bridgeport, but the most striking thing besides this beautiful valley is the Eastern Sierra itself, which rises up starkly above the valley. On the western side of the Sierra, it slopes gently through foothills and then pine forest as it rises. And the Sierra from the west never really looks imposing. Before you know it, you're climbing and climbing, and then you're right in the middle of it. But from the east, there's a stark contrast between the high desert and the sharply rising eastern crest of the Sierra. And from Bridgeport, you have a beautiful view of the northeastern corner of Yosemite and the Hoover Wilderness that rise up above it. But before we jump into the Benson Lake Loop, let's talk about this area, which is something worth seeing. In 1827, Jedediah Strong Smith crossed the Sierra looking for gold, and he found the Bridgeport Valley. In 1843, John C. Fremont and his guide Kit Carson also camped in this valley. In 1859, about 7 miles south of Bridgeport and up against the Sierra Nevada, a settlement called Dogtown was founded. And this was the first placer gold mining in the Eastern Sierra. And there was a short boom, and it lasted only a few years. In 1861, Mono County was formed, and Bridgeport was part of Mono County. There was a town called Aurora that was the county seat of Mono County. But in 1863, they did a survey, and it turned out Aurora was actually in Nevada. It wasn't even part of California. So then Bridgeport became the county seat of Mono County. In 1877, Hiram Levitt built a grand house in Bridgeport. He had a stage stop business, Bridgeport was along a stage route. And Leavitt later became a judge of Mono County. Leavitt lived in that house until 1901 when he died. Today, the Leavitt House is the Bridgeport Inn. The Bridgeport Inn is the nicest restaurant in town and the nicest hotel in town. And if you exclude motels, it's pretty much the only hotel in town. Be careful with room 16. It's supposedly haunted by the White Lady, which is the ghost of a young woman. The story is that her fiancé accidentally died, and then she hung herself in that room in her wedding gown. And ever since, it's been rumored to be haunted. So you've got the Bridgeport Inn. You also have the historic courthouse for Mono County, which is still in use today and has a museum attached to it as well. The courthouse was built in 1881. So you've got this cute little town, basically a one-street town, in the middle of the high desert east of the mountains. And in 2020, my wife and son and I decided we're going to spend a week out there so we can have a different feel for a while and also to get an opportunity to do some hiking. We stayed in a 2-room cabin. And when we got to the cabin, we learned that it wasn't actually built in Bridgeport. It was actually moved to Bridgeport from Bodie. Well, what's Bodie, you ask? Well, that's another story. W.S. Bodie came from Poughkeepsie, New York. In 1848, he read the news of California's gold rush. A little side note here, yes, the gold rush actually started in 1848, not 1849, despite the legend of 1849. 1849 is basically when everybody arrived. So Bodie in 1848 learns about gold being found in California, and he leaves Poughkeepsie, New York for California, leaving behind his wife and 2 children. He set sail around the Cape and eventually landed in San Francisco. And you have to think about that for a minute. He's got a wife and 2 young kids, and he essentially abandons them to go look for gold in California. I'm not really sure what was going on there with that family, but things couldn't have been too good. So Bodie arrives in California in 1849, like lots of other prospectors, and he dedicates himself to trying to find gold. 10 years later, in 1859, Bodie finally found what he was looking for, but not along the western foothills of the Sierra where most of the gold was found. Instead, he found it in the high desert east of the Sierra, in what is today about a 13-mile drive from Bridgeport, 10 miles on highway, and 3 miles on dirt road. And so W.S. Bodie found gold, but his luck didn't last long, and he would never profit from his discovery. In November 1859, Bodie and his Native American mining partner, who was called Black Taylor, were making a supply run to a nearby town when they got caught in a blizzard. They tried to go back, but Bodie eventually couldn't go any further, and Taylor left him there and went to go get supplies to bring back to Bodie, but got lost in the blizzard coming back and couldn't find Bodie. Bodie's body wasn't found until the following spring. Although that was the end of W.S. Bodie, it was just the beginning of the town of Bodie. Bodie remained a small mining camp until 1875. But in 1875, a mine collapsed and it revealed a rich body of gold ore, and the boomtown began. The population boomed to 8,000 people or more. And this is in a tough setting. This is at 8,375 feet in the high desert, but over 8,000 people ended up living there despite the tough environment. And you can imagine the high desert is going to be brutally hot in the summer and brutally cold in the winter. So the elements were certainly a factor. From 1877 to 1881, Bodie had its heyday. There were 30 mines. There were 9 stamp mills. The Standard Mill is the biggest building that's still standing in Bodie. These stamp mills were used to make iron rods that were then used to break up the rock ore. Bodie pretty quickly acquired a rough reputation. There were more than 60 saloons. There were brothels. It had a Chinatown with opium dens. Gunfights were said to be common. And sometimes the rough life meant vigilante justice. In 1881, a miner named Thomas Treloar, was shot and killed at the corner of Main and Low Streets in Bodie by a guy named Joseph DeRoche, who was having an affair with Treloar's wife. DeRoche was arrested but escaped. A posse tracked him down 2 days later, and he was taken to Bodie's jail, but he never made it to court. A vigilante committee took him from his cell and hung him in front of the county barn. The boom years in Bodie were over pretty quickly. By 1886, the town's population had dropped to 1,500 people. Mining continued, though, until 1942. By then, 2 major fires had burned most of the structures of Bodie. And in 1962, the State Park Service purchased what was left. And I have to say, even though only 5% of the buildings are left, it's a lot. It looks like hundreds of buildings. It's more than I've seen in any other ghost town I've ever been to. And you can visit Bodie today and walk around the town and get a sense of what it's like. The State Park Service keeps Bodie in a state of what they call arrested decay, which means the existing buildings are stabilized, but they're not restored. You can look through the windows and see a lot of the items from the time period. Piano in a saloon, barbershop chairs in the barbershops, pool table in a hotel, some clothing, jars, bottles. Pretty much anything that was left was kept in the same condition that it had been in. So if you're going to go hike the Benson Lake Loop and you're going to spend the night before your hike probably in Bridgeport, consider spending an extra day in the area to see Bodie. I think it's definitely worth the trip, and I really enjoyed it. A couple other things to keep in mind, maybe for after your trip, is there are 2 wonderful hot springs in the area. There's Buckeye Hot Springs and Travertine Hot Springs. Both of these are natural hot springs, not resorts. And with Buckeye, you park by the side of a river and climb down maybe 50 feet of hillside, and there are several pools of hot mineral water up against the river itself, and it's just a fantastic spot. In Travertine, it's a really kind of different experience with pools spread out over a wider area with this sort of milky, yellowish travertine rock making up a lot of the area and several different pools. Although I found the water a little bit more tepid at Travertine and really enjoyed the sort of extreme heat of Buckeye Hot Springs the most. So those are other things you could do in the area. If you're a fisherman, Bridgeport is really known for the trout fishing in the area. The Walker River and a lot of the streams that come out of the Sierra are fantastic for fishing. There's lots of Forest Service campgrounds as well as several good private campgrounds in the area and sort of smallish resorts. And there's even a dude ranch just out of Bridgeport. If you're looking for that kind of experience, that could be an interesting thing to do. A guy I work with actually has done that a couple of times out there by Bridgeport and really enjoyed that experience of being a cattle rancher for a week. So now let's talk about the Benson Lake Loop. So as I mentioned, you're up against this sort of steep escarpment of the Eastern Sierra. And like all of the Sierra, you have some of the same considerations. There's the same kind of animal life. There's bears, there's deer, there's marmots at higher altitudes. The Eastern Sierra is a little bit different, or at least this part of it, than the Western Sierra, also because there's less trees. It's more rocky. There's also an abundance of aspen tree groves at the altitude of a lot of the trailheads and campgrounds. So if you end up camping the night before, there are some areas that are just in beautiful aspen groves. If you're there in the fall, like I was with my daughter Sonia in September 2018, and with my son and my wife in October 2020, the aspen groves can be just outstanding, yellow and orange and red in their fall colors. And so, but once you get above those aspen groves and above some pines, it becomes a pretty rocky expanse and a really sort of classic high Sierra granite. Although the granite here is often more red, maybe there's more iron and very different than some of the granite you see along the Western Sierra. The hike itself starts in the Hoover Wilderness. This is an area that was protected as a primitive area since 1931. It became what's called a wild area in 1956. But then in 1964, when the United States enacted the Wilderness Act, it became one of the original wilderness areas. And as you may remember from prior episodes, a wilderness area is one where you're not allowed to build any roads or any structures. So it's truly wilderness within a national forest. Here it's the Humboldt-Toiyabe National Forest in the northern part of the Hoover Wilderness and the Inyo National Forest in the southern part. The part where this hike goes through is in the Humboldt-Toiyabe National Forest. Strangely, this was named after, as you might imagine, President Herbert Hoover, who many consider responsible for the Great Depression, so not a fan favorite president for many, but nonetheless has a fantastic wilderness area named after him. And in 2009, the size of this wilderness was expanded significantly, which is great to see. Once you get past the first day of the hike, you end up for a good chunk of the remainder of the hike in Yosemite National Park. I will spend much more time talking about the history of Yosemite on a different episode. For this episode, I'll just say that Yosemite was created in 1890, so this area up against the Hoover Wilderness has also been protected for quite a long time. But I think what's most important about this part of Yosemite to know is that it's a very lightly traveled part of Yosemite. It's sort of the northeast corner of Yosemite. It's the most remote, hardest to get to, and for my money, one of the best places in Yosemite to go for exactly these reasons. You really see very few people hiking it, and it's just beautiful canyon after canyon that you have completely to yourself. And so in some ways, it doesn't feel like you're in Yosemite National Park because it's so remote and it doesn't have the crowds and a lot of the sort of classic features that everybody thinks about when they think of Yosemite, like Half Dome or El Capitan, which are in the valley, or even Tuolumne Meadows. The hike starts at the top of the road to Twin Lakes. Twin Lakes is, between 10 and 15 miles out of Bridgeport, heading straight toward the mountains. And it's two big, beautiful lakes with lots of camping, a private campground at the end of the road. And one of the things that you can do if you spend some time in this area, or if you want to warm up for your big hike, is there are some great day hiking opportunities. One of them is out of Twin Lakes, and that's called Tamarack Lake. And when I was there in October of 2020, my son and I did a hike up to Tamarack Lake. It's about 4 miles each way, so an 8-mile hike with quite a bit of gain of elevation. But it brings you to a really beautiful lake, great lunch spot. We only saw one other person there, so it's a nice day hike opportunity. There's also a really popular trailhead a little ways south of Bridgeport called Virginia Lakes that really is great, especially if you're with children, because it can bring you up into some beautiful lakes very quickly. There's probably a dozen lakes within just 2 to 3 miles of the trailhead. We actually were able to do a pretty long day hike of about 11 miles between Virginia Lakes and the Green Lakes trailhead. Green Lake is also another great trailhead to hike out of up there. And so, the big message here is if you're going to go to this area, you've got great backpacking opportunities from multiple trailheads, and you've also got really great day hiking opportunities as well. But let's now focus on the Benson Lake Loop. Benson Lake is within Yosemite National Park. It's actually named after a Yosemite National Park official, Harry Coupland Benson. It's actually also just on a small spur trail of about half a mile off of the Pacific Crest Trail, which I'm sure many of you know is a 2,650 mile or more than 4,000 kilometer trail that goes from Mexico to Canada and passes through this area. In fact, Benson Lake is at a low point along the PCT for about 100 miles or 160 kilometers. So for many miles on either side of Benson Lake, the PCT is going uphill, and Benson Lake is at sort of the bottom of a long stretch of trail, which brings us to its most interesting feature. Benson Lake has a really broad, sandy beach. I've been there twice, and it's just been phenomenal both times. I've really fallen in love with this spot. But I do wonder, it's so unique. No other beach I've seen in the Sierra looks like this. Often a lake will have a very small stretch of beach where you can sit down, but it's hard to call most of those even a beach. But the beach at Benson Lake is truly a beach. And I think the reason for it, and this is just me guessing, is because it is at the bottom of a long stretch of area. It's sort of a funnel and a creek that heads down to the lake. And then the back end of the lake, opposite the beach, has some high rocks and some hills that form a natural dam. And so I think what's happening is that erosion is bringing this crushed granite down the waterways and making this beach. And so I think it's likely that because it is at such a low point, that is the exact reason it has such a phenomenal beach. So let's talk about the logistics for doing this hike. So this is really a summer hike. In the High Sierra, you really want to be looking midsummer to early fall. So even June would be too early, probably still be too much snow. But by late July, certainly, everything would be passable in most years. And probably into early October before you really are worrying about heavy snow coming in the next season. So you've got this window from midsummer to early fall. That's the best time to do this hike. And you can expect to have summer mountain weather. In California, that means most of the time it's pretty dry and warm in the day and can be very, very cold at night. So you have to be prepared for a wide range of temperature. But thunderstorms do happen, and I've been caught in several pretty bad hailstorms or thunderstorms. And so you really do have to be prepared for wet weather and possibly even dustings of snow at time, even in the summer. But for the most part, you're likely to get lucky and have good weather. The hike is about 50 miles or about 80 kilometers. I would recommend taking between 4 and 6 days to do this hike. I really think 5 days is probably the sweet spot. My daughter Sonia and I ended up doing the hike in 4 days, but that was a deliberate choice to push on the last day to go further than we had planned. We had originally planned to do it in 5 days. The elevation on the hike starts at 7,095 feet, which is about 2,162 meters, and ranges up to 10,650 feet, or 3,246 meters. You're going to be fine with standard mountain backpacking gear. You could go back to episode 2 on the High Sierra Trail if you want to hear a general overview of what that means, or just look it up online if you're not familiar with it. A lot of people post online gear lists for 3-season mountain backpacking. Couple of things that you definitely need to think about in the Sierra that you may not always have to worry about in other locations. One is water filtration. You need to have either a chemical or filter or gravity fed or some kind of water filtration system. The other thing you need to have that is not unique, but certainly unusual is a bear can. The Sierra has bears that are very smart and very used to people. And as a result, if you don't properly store your food, it will be a problem. And so you can either rent a bear can if you don't have one or bring your own. And, hiking in the Sierra, carrying a bear can is just something you get used to. It's required in Yosemite National Park, and I believe it is now also required in the Hoover Wilderness. So on this hike, you definitely need to have a bear can. My daughter Sonia and I each carried a bear can. For navigation on this hike, the gold standard is really the Tom Harrison Hoover Wilderness map. I've talked before on the show about Tom Harrison maps. They make fantastic recreation maps. You can buy them online. And they have one for the Hoover Wilderness that covers this hike. To get to the hike, it's about a 4.5-hour drive from the San Francisco Bay Area. To get there, you go over beautiful Sonora Pass on Highway 108, which is just a really neat sort of reddish Martian or moonscape kind of area. Very different than a lot of the Sierra when you go through that pass driving. But that's how you get there. And then you drop into that Eastern Sierra. I recommend spending a night before in Bridgeport, mostly for acclimatization. You will be at over 6,000 feet in Bridgeport. And if you do like most people do and you hike the first day up to Peeler Lake, you're going from 7,000 to 9,500 feet. And so you want some acclimatization. And the best way to do that is to spend a night in Bridgeport. Or better yet, if you want to drive up to Twin Lakes or one of the other campgrounds that's a little higher up and camp, you'll have even higher elevation by doing that and get to spend an evening in the beautiful aspen groves potentially. And that's another good way to acclimatize. You do need permits for this trip, and you need to reserve them in advance. There are walk-ups available, meaning you can show up the morning or actually the day before, I believe, to get a permit. But most of the sites, I think 2/3 of the reservations go in advance. And so the best bet is to reserve your permit in advance. If you look online for the Humboldt-Toiyabe National Forest and for the Hoover Wilderness, there are permit applications that you fill out in advance. I would start looking at these months in advance. I don't recall exactly how far in advance they let you get a permit, but if you look online, as soon as you become interested in this trip, you'll figure out the deadlines. So back in 2018, when we did this trip together, my daughter Sonia was 18 years old. She had just finished high school and she was about to go off to college. And the college she goes to doesn't start classes until late September. And so we were able to do this trip in September, which is a great time to do it because most people are back in school and there's less hikers on the trail and obviously less snow by that time of year in the mountains, also less mosquitoes. And so that's a great time to do it. And we really enjoyed that trip. Recently, we had a conversation about our hike of the Benson Lake Loop. So now I'm going to bring you some of my thoughts about this trip as well as some of the conversation I had with my daughter Sonia about our hike of the Benson Lake Loop. Sonia, welcome to the show. It's great to have you on the show again.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited.
All right. Do you remember the Benson Lake Loop trip?
I do. It was beautiful from the time we started driving there to pulling out.
We drove up Twin Lakes Road, past the Twin Lakes, into Mono Village and parked. Mono Village is a private campground, has a little restaurant. They rent kayaks for the lakes. There's a little beach, actually, and marina. It's a little bit kitschy, a little bit dated, or maybe quite a bit dated, but still a very nice campground with lots of great sights in a pine forest. We walked through the campground and eventually found the Robinson Creek trailhead toward the back of the campground. You start the hike out walking through the forest. You get the smell of the pine trees. You get this really beautiful feeling of getting underway, like you often feel on a hike like this. And then the hike starts ascending a little bit, and you come out of the pine trees and you start entering into aspen groves, which even by September have some color, though not as much as they would have a few weeks later. The trail winds its way uphill. At the trailhead, you're at 7,095 feet. So that's 2,162 meters. And in that first day of the hike, we were traveling 7.5 miles or about 12 kilometers to reach 2,892 meters or 9,489 feet at Peeler Lake. So it's quite a bit of uphill in a relatively short distance. After about 4 miles, you reach Barney Lake. And Barney Lake is a pretty lake, kind of an oval shape. But what's great about it is at the bottom end of the lake, where you come up to the lake, is a small beach where you can sit down for a moment, take a break, have a snack. And when you look toward the back of the lake, you see the high country directly behind it. You see the high peaks you're going to be hiking around. And again, you just feel that much closer and that much more excited to get into the mountains. Also, Barney Lake is the last place you're going to see day hikers. It's a nice day hike to go from the Robinson Creek trailhead up to Barney Lake, about 4 miles, and then make that an 8-mile round trip. And some people even go maybe a little further. But it's really the point where you lose the day hikers, and the trail scrambles up along the rocks along the right-hand side of the lake and then starts switching back, ascending up to eventually a trail junction where you head off toward Peeler Lake. And that junction is where the end of this trail, the end of this hike meets back up with this part of the hike. So this hike is really a lollipop loop, meaning the first 7 or so miles you have to repeat at the end of the hike, and then the loop starts after that first 7 or so miles. So as you get close to Peeler Lake, you're starting to feel like you're in the high country. You've gained quite a bit of altitude. We had a pretty hot day. It was pretty hot and exposed going up the switchbacks. But by mid-afternoon, we had passed that junction of the Lollipop Loop, and we reached Peeler Lake soon after. Peeler Lake is at 9,489 feet, as I said. It's a pretty round lake surrounded by granite, but no towering peaks close by, so it has a little bit of an open field behind it. And when you go along the side of the lake where the trail follows to the right, you come upon a pretty big camping area that's in the trees. And there was one other small group there when we arrived, and we decided to set up as far as we could from them within that same area. And from there, we got cleaned up by going for a swim. The water was cold but refreshing, and we still had time to dry off because it was only mid-afternoon. What do you remember about Peeler Lake?
I remember swimming in my underwear and feeling very refreshed. I also remember I got a fresh tattoo right before this trip, so I didn't want to dunk it completely in the water. So I remember kind of wading around and dipping strategically in.
The other group that was there had some additional friends that showed up a little bit later. But we had a pretty quiet evening and a nice night at Peeler Lake. Peeler Lake is in the Hoover Wilderness, but it's the last thing that's really in the Hoover Wilderness before you cross into Yosemite National Park. By the way, there seemed to be some camping that might have been good on the backside of Peeler Lake too, among the granite shelves that were there, but we camped among the trees instead. So after we left Peeler Lake in the morning, we crossed the sign that said that we were entering Yosemite National Park, and then we entered into Carrick Meadow. On day 2, we were going to be going 11 miles, or about 18 kilometers, starting at the Peeler Lake elevation of 9,489 feet, and eventually, after some up and down, dropping all the way down to 7,581 feet, or 2,311 meters, at Benson Lake, which is really our primary goal for the trip. We took our time crossing Carrick Meadow. The trail hugs the right-hand side of the meadow before crossing over the creek in the middle eventually. Carrick Meadow is long and beautiful in kind of a shallow valley. When we crossed the stream, we sat and rested for a while. There were fish swimming in the stream. It was a very peaceful stream by September. If you had crossed a stream like that in June, it would have been a different story. We went through, the first thing we did after Peeler Lake is we went through Carrick Meadow. Do you remember Carrick Meadow?
I do remember Carrick Meadow. I especially remember walking along a little creek within the meadow for a bit. It was really beautiful green, and there were fishies and everything. It felt very almost biblical. I don't know.
And after resting there, we kept going. Eventually, at about mile 7.3 on the day, or about 12 kilometers into the day, at 8,850 feet, or 2,697 meters, we joined the Pacific Crest Trail. That's a trail that goes from Mexico all the way to Canada through California, Oregon, and Washington. It's 2,650 miles of trail, 4,265 kilometers long. Hikers typically start hiking in April and finish just before the snow in the early fall in Washington and at the Canadian border. We were going to be traveling south along the PCT for that day and a good portion of the next day. Soon after joining the PCT, going south, we reached CV Pass. Seaview Pass is a pretty low pass. It's 9,150 feet or 2,789 meters. The climb to get up to Seaview Pass is relatively easy, but still a climb nonetheless. There's a nice little lake at the top. Then we found a pond to sit down by and have lunch. And from Seaview Pass, the rest of that day is pretty much downhill. As you start heading downhill into the valley where Benson Lake is, you can see the peaks in the distance to the south that you're going to be approaching the next day. By mid-afternoon, we reached Benson Lake. Benson Lake, as I mentioned, is at 7,581 feet or 2,311 meters. To get to Benson Lake, you go down, 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 and then you come to a spur trail where there's a creek. And just before the creek, the spur trail goes to the right toward the lake, which is to the west at that point. And it's about a half a mile down a spur trail through a kind of marshy, forested area that earlier in the season would mean pretty bad mosquitoes, but by September is mostly dry. And then you see it, Benson Lake with its magnificent beach. You come out where the creek is, and probably 3/4 of the beach is to your right, and another quarter beyond the creek is on the left. And you can hardly believe your eyes. It's a beautiful beach. It's wide. It has fine sand. And it's at the shore of a beautiful lake backed by impressive mountains. And what did you think of Benson Lake when we arrived there?
I thought it was insane that there was a beach in the middle of the mountains, and it just this beautiful shoreline, and then just kind of straight rock up to some peaks.
Yeah, the beach is actually quite large. It's really thick all the way across. It's a beach that you'd be happy to have on any ocean shore. It's really not like a mountain lake beach. It's more like an ocean beach.
Very smooth sand, but it was only on one side of the lake from what I can remember.
That's correct. Yeah, it's only on the side you come in on. And we spent the afternoon and the evening there. We camped behind some trees on the beach, right?
Yeah, I remember we needed a windbreak.
Exactly, yeah. It wasn't too bad, though, from what I mean. I don't think it was that windy while we were there.
No, but I definitely wouldn't have wanted to camp right up against the water. It was, I remember it being too breezy for that to really seem like a good idea.
Yeah, I think that's right. It's the second time I'd been to Benson Lake, and the other time camped also kind of behind the main berm of the beach, the first rise of the sand, and then there's a sort of back part of it where most people seem to camp, and most of the fire rings are. A lot of times there can be quite a number of people at Benson Lake because it's a popular destination. Even though it's fairly remote, I do think a lot of people like to go there in the summer. But when we were there, it was pretty much empty.
Yeah, I remember there was one other group, I think.
And I thought we had a nice afternoon and evening there, and it's really a great place to spend half a day if you can get there early enough in the day to enjoy it, right?
Mm-hmm. Definitely. You want as much daylight as you can in this spot, definitely, so you can swim and then have time to dry off before a cold night.
I recently talked with my friend and friend of the show, Tony Wong, about our 2013 hike of a section of the Pacific Crest Trail. On that trip, we camped at Benson Lake, and that was the first time I had been to Benson Lake. Tony, thanks for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me. You're not sick of me, so I keep showing up.
Do you remember that once upon a time we went to Benson Lake?
Yes, it was a while back, 2013, July.
That's right. So we were doing a trip along the Pacific Crest Trail. We were hiking a section from Carson Pass south to Tuolumne Meadows. And I think we did that in 8 days, and it's like 130 miles or something like that.
130 miles. Yeah, 8 or 9 days.
Probably 2/3 of the way into that trip was when we got to Benson Lake. Do you have a memory of that day?
Oh, yeah. Quite a bit. It was a day of lots of contrast in the sense, kind of woke up, hiking along, weather's kind of good, a little overcast, 70s, to getting rained on, thunder, lightning, sitting under a tree, waiting for it to kind of blow by.
See, that's funny that you remember that because I just have a memory of a nice day in the afternoon at Benson Lake and it being like a nice day at the beach. I have a memory of there being bad weather on this trip, but I don't have a memory of that bad weather being the same day that we went to Benson Lake, which is weird to me that I completely blocked that out of my memory. Though now that you say it, I think when we went over CV Pass, which is the pass that's right before Benson Lake, we were in our yellow rain gear heading over the pass.
Mm-hmm. We were. That whole trip, I mean, at the very beginning of the trip, early on, our first day or two, it was in the 90s. We had a day where it started at 90 degrees, and we got hailed on near the end. There was some wild contrast of days, a few days of weather there. It was pretty wild.
Okay, so that day, the day we went to Benson Lake, we were actually getting rained on. We had some pretty tough weather. Mm-hmm. But then when we got to the lake, the weather was fine, right?
Yes, it was kind of a great way to end a long day. When we got there, the sun had really just broken, and we were kind of wet. Not like dripping wet. We had rain jackets on, but like our legs weren't. We didn't have rain pants. We chose not to wear them. So we set up our tarps, bivvy, and we were able to lay some things out to dry. Actually, so we're getting a little bit of relief. It was a long day too. You
say we had a long day, but we didn't get there that late in the day. I think it was probably 2:30, 3 o'clock at the latest.
No, I had it down as 5:30.
Was it really?
Yeah, we spent a lot of time sitting on a log waiting for the storm to pass.
Oh, earlier in the day.
Earlier in the day, but I suspect that sitting on the log was in the afternoon.
All right, well, listeners, beware. Do not trust my memory. Trust Tony's photographs.
To be fair, I've gone through the photographs and through videos last night and just even before as a little refresher. So that's why I can remember a lot. It's not that my memory's great. I just shoot a crap load of video and pictures.
And so let me ask you, before we got to Benson Lake, did you have any idea what we were going to see?
No clue. I mean, you know me. I mean, I barely know where I'm going. I'm just following you. Whatever color your shoes are, it's that guy. I'm looking at, follow the guy through, the orange colored shoes. I bring a map. It's laughable. It's in case space aliens get you, and then I have to pull out the map. But no,
right.
You just stay in front of me and I just follow you.
Okay. And so we take a little spur trail off of the Pacific Crest Trail. It's sort of at this low point in the trail. We go to Benson Lake and you come out of the trees and you see, what do you see?
Well, bunch of trees. It kind of thins out. There's kind of a green grassy area. There's brush, some bushes that could maybe be as high as maybe 8 feet. But the thing that really stands out is there's all this sand. It's a full-on beach, kind of brownish in color, and a serene, really placid lake. To your left and to your right is just big granite kind of going up, and then off in the distance there is lesser granite. But you can see the horizon to some extent. It's gorgeous, absolutely. I thought it was just surreal. I kept saying to myself, "There's a beach here. How the hell? There's a beach."
And a lot of times you go to a lake in the mountains and I'm going to use air quotes. There's a beach in air quotes. And that's usually just a little tiny wedge of sand somewhere where you can sit down. But Benson Lake, we're talking about a real beach, right?
It's real. I mean, walking distance, you could play volleyball out there if you really wanted to, if you had a net.
Oh, easily, yeah.
Easily.
Yeah.
It was really quite impressive. I mean, I remember getting my shoes and wiggling my toes and having dinner, just enjoying the end of a long, nice day and relaxing and having this beautiful view. And I'm kind of looking at it going, I just never would have imagined it at this elevation. I don't know if it was 6,000 or 8,000, but
I think it's about 7,500 where the lake is.
Yeah, it's just not something I would have ever thought. I know that we kind of walked into the water, had a chance to kind of, clean up, take a dip in there. Sandy, really beautiful beach. I even remember when I set up my little bivy bag underneath the little tarp, I actually made a little ramp of sand for like a pillow to kind of elevate my head because you can.
Explain for someone who comes to this beach what it's like as far as camping there. I mean, there is camping on the beach, but you're not sort of on the main beach. You're kind of camping behind the main part of the beach,
Yeah.
right?
There's kind of the slope of the lake shore. So that's kind of the beach that I'm talking about where we hung out and, kind of relaxed. But after that, the amazing thing, it continues on and it kind of flattens out. Some of that will eventually bleed into the trees, as well as there were some spots of grass, almost like meadow, very low. So where we were able to set up pitch our tarps, there were trees kind of around us, bigger trees, but it's still open. So I really have to impress. There's a lot of space. There's a lot of sand, like a parking lot. You could chuck cars there. It's that big. I know at one point I was kind of at the beach area where it's kind of sloped where the water is. You were back at the campsite. I think you were moving your tarp. You were concerned about widowmakers because there was a lot of wind. You were worried about, hey, maybe a big branch comes down, takes you out or takes us out. So you kind of moved around. And there was enough room to move around. There were other people there. I remember seeing some other, maybe 2, 4 other people. Plenty of space, distance. In fact, I even remarked, it was so beautiful. It'd be nice to spend a whole day there, except for I've got the Chihuahua genie and I can't sit still. So you just got to keep going.
Yeah. And when I came back with Sonia, with my daughter, several years later, we did get there early in the afternoon and we really spent the entire afternoon there, which was great.
Yeah.
And I'd go back again. This is one of those places I would absolutely take whoever else wants to go back there. I'd go back again. All right, Tony. Well, thanks for coming on the show to talk about Benson Lake.
Hey, anytime. Love to kind of relive the memories and the suffering.
As I think I mentioned in the intro, it seems to me it's likely that the low location of Benson Lake along this part of the mountain range is the reason for the beach, because all of this silt has washed down the creek to the edge of the lake over the years. We again went for a swim and then enjoyed a day at the beach, as one should, where there's a beautiful beach. Laying out on our towels. We set up camp behind the beach. Sonia went to take a nap in the tent once we had our camp set up. At the time that we arrived at Benson Lake, there was a couple there, a young couple, and they walked by and went to the other side of the creek to a part of the lake that has less plants growing in the water so that it's easier to swim. And I laid down on the beach and just took in the scenery and enjoyed the afternoon while Sonia napped. After a while, the young woman who had gone to the other end of the beach was coming back toward me and was going to go past me to where they had set up camp. And she was in her swimsuit bottom and nothing else. She smiled as she approached me. So I'm a guy in my late 40s at this point in 2018 on this hike. And as you might imagine, it's not every day that a young topless woman approaches me with a smile. But that's what she did and said hello. I said hello and then quickly looked at my shoes. She walked past, and 5 minutes later, I was wondering whether I had dreamed the whole thing. In any event, our afternoon at Benson Lake was relaxing, and we had a nice evening there and a nice night. There was a little wind for part of the time, but most of the time it was very nice. And for the second day in a row, I'd been able to swim in a nice lake. The next day, day 3 of the hike, we had planned to go from Benson Lake to Matterhorn Canyon. That trip is about 13 and a half miles or 22 kilometers. The most notable thing about this day of the hike is the huge amount of uphill we were going to have to do, as you can imagine, leaving a low point along the trail. There were huge gains in the beginning of the day. We were climbing and climbing through the forest, and it was starting to get warm already, and we were sweating it out, working our way uphill.
Oh yeah. Oh my gosh. I was not in my body. I was like when you daydream so hard that because you're like facing something so extreme that you need like a small escape for a second. That's how it was climbing that out of Benson Lake up.
After a while, we arrived at Smedberg Lake, which is at 9,219 feet or 2,810 meters. Smedberg Lake is a very pretty lake among granite near a meadow and below Benson Pass. It's at this point that we came across a hiker who was doing a big stretch of the PCT.
We ran into that through hiker who was like grunting. I think we were take a break, and I remember he just grunted at us. He was like,
And I don't remember if he was, in September, he wouldn't be doing the whole PCT, but he was doing a big chunk of it, I think.
like a solid chunk. Like it seemed like he hadn't seen people in weeks.
So after taking a break at Smedberg Lake and soaking our feet, we made it to Benson Pass by lunch. Benson Pass is about 6.5 miles into the day, or 10.5 kilometers. The pass is at 10,140 feet, or 3,091 meters. You have to work your way up a gully full of bushes and boulders, although there is a trail, but it's a pretty narrow gully to get to the pass. But the pass was a nice place to take a break and have lunch before we descended into Matterhorn Canyon. And what do you remember about Matterhorn Canyon?
Wow. I remember the light being really beautiful, watching it change throughout the day as the sun would come up and go over it. So that day, as we were hiking in, it was pretty far overhead, or like about like kind of evening sun, and it was really beautiful. It's like a west to east facing canyon, right?
I think that's right, exactly, because you're starting to head back.
I think that's what I'm trying to say. Yeah, the lighting in it is very specific because of that. It's really cool.
We made it to the bottom of Matterhorn Canyon, crossed the creek in the middle of the canyon, and started walking up the canyon. Arriving in Matterhorn Canyon, or any canyon like this in the backcountry of the Sierra, is probably my favorite experience backpacking. The reason I love it so much is that you arrive at a place that is as beautiful as Yosemite Valley. And there's lots of these places. There's canyons all over the Sierra, particularly in Yosemite National Park and in Sequoia and Kings Canyon National Park. They're just outstandingly beautiful. And what's so fantastic about them is when you arrive, you realize you have these canyons entirely to yourself. We didn't see anyone in Matterhorn Canyon for hours. We enjoyed the walk up the canyon, enjoying the granite and the forest and the canyon walls and the sun and the creek. But eventually we started realizing we needed to find a campsite. We were slowly ascending the canyon, and we started looking for a site, but it took quite a while to find a good one. But eventually we did, and we set up camp along the creek coming down the middle of Matterhorn Canyon. And by the way, it was at the beginning of Matterhorn Canyon, when we turned up the canyon, that we left the Pacific Crest Trail, which continued its way south toward Tuolumne Meadows. For some reason, we didn't sleep that great that night. It may have been because we decided at that point that we were going to try to push all the way out the next day, which would be a 17 or 18 mile day. I think Sonia had decided that she'd rather not spend a fifth day just seeing the first part of the Lollipop that we had already traveled, and instead wanted to see how far we could go on day 4 and if we could get all the way back to the end of the trail. So on day 4, that's what we did. We woke up early and were on the trail by 7 in the morning. We went up Matterhorn Canyon, and we were going all the way to the trailhead at Twin Lakes, which was about 28 kilometers, or about 17 or 18 miles. Our first goal was to climb Burro Pass, which takes you out of Matterhorn Canyon. This day we were going to have to climb over 2 high passes, Burro Pass and then Mule Pass. Both of these passes have a bit of an appearance of an old Western movie. Look like they could be hiding cattle rustlers or outlaws. And we climbed and climbed Burro Pass until we reached the pass at 10,650 feet, or 3,246 meters, which was the high point of the entire hike as far as altitude goes. And what do you remember about that morning?
I remember the light in the morning was so beautiful when we were coming up out of the canyon. It was like the morning alpine, like pinkish kind of glow. It was very beautiful. And it was a very narrow piece of trail, like right up to where you actually are coming out of the, like on the pass.
Yeah, pretty narrow pass. And then there's a little bit of a drop, and we were at some pretty big high country, which I thought was beautiful, with some neat pines and just some meadows and creeks and that kind of thing. And then you climb up again to Mule Pass.
Yeah, it felt like we were completely alone when we were doing that part of the hike. Like, it was very beautiful and really nice in solitude.
After coming off of Burro Pass, we went through a valley that was still very high altitude, so it didn't drop down that much, but it had somewhat of a forested cover of some smaller trees. And then eventually we came into some bigger trees, and we passed a trail crew that was camping there for a long period of time, it looked like, maybe for a week or so. Then we started working our way back uphill to Mule Pass. We crossed Mule Pass at 10,470 feet, or 3,191 meters, in the early afternoon. After Mule Pass, we came across a huge snowfield, possibly a glacier. I don't know the technical difference. It was a pretty good size, so it could have been a glacier. But if not, it was a large snowfield, definitely a permanent snowfield, as it was still there in September. And it was dripping water, and you could see a cave through the ice, and the trail was flooded because of the melting of the snow. And we started working our way down. The rocky trail was filled with some granite mud and running water. And eventually by mid-afternoon, we made it down to, it was either Crown Lake or the Robinson Lakes. I don't remember which. We passed both. And if we had been doing this trip in 5 days like we had originally planned, we would have camped at one of these lakes. And I remember taking off our shoes and putting our feet in the water and talking about whether we would stay there, but it was pretty clear that Sonia wanted to keep pushing on. And I think we got to Crown Lake or Robinson Lakes. There's a couple of lakes there. There's Crown Lake first and then Robinson Lakes. We got to them at maybe 2 or 2:30 in the afternoon after a really long morning. And I think said we could stop here and camp. That was our original plan. And you said what?
Let's keep going.
Yeah. So we spent a little time with our shoes off and put our feet in the water and just sort of relaxed, and then put our packs back on and started hiking again. And so we did that. And we made it to the car by 7 or 7:30 at night, something like that. And we basically hiked an 11 and a half or 12-hour day, climbed 2 Sierra passes, and made our way all the way back to the car on day 4. I think one of the most beautiful parts of the hike for me was Upper Matterhorn Canyon that morning. It's a large, wide open bowl, kind of Sierra Canyon, marmot country, and really beautiful. All right. And so when you think back on this trip, Sonia, what did you like about it? Like, what sticks out in your mind as why this was a good trip?
It wasn't too far for ultimate solitude / only really meeting up with other people who were out there to be deep in it, and just the variation of different landmarks that we were able to see in such a short time. I don't know anywhere else you can do something like that.
I think you hit it right on the head. Going to the Eastern Sierra does that. The Eastern Sierra, you get into the high country so fast because you're already so high up where the trailheads are that you really do. You get to these amazing remote places without going that far. And that's what I agree with you. Whenever I do a trip from the eastern side of the Sierra, I always feel that way, that almost immediately you are really in the wilderness. And it's a cool feeling to be able to do that. So anything happen on this trip that you didn't expect or surprised you?
I think the snowfield was probably the thing I didn't expect the most, just because when you talked about the trip and you originally invited me, it was like, oh, we're going to go to this beach kind of lake in the Sierra. And I was like, cool. Snow didn't really come to mind. But then we were face to face with a huge field of snow and like the rock hopping between big patches of mud and then just like a straight drop into this canyon. I was like, whoa, this is not what I was expecting, but I'm really glad that this is part of the experience.
That's cool. Yeah. I thought that was neat too. We were all the way into September, probably the driest part of the year. And there was still this, basically, like you said, almost a glacier. I don't know if it's technically a glacier or not, but that's basically what it was, a permanent snowfield that was, creating all this water. That was a really cool thing to see.
It was also kind of nerve-wracking because I remember thinking, oh, I didn't plan for snow. I hope I don't slip and hurt myself. But it also ended up being one of the most rewarding parts of the trip.
Cool. All right, Sonia, while I have you, I have a few more questions.
Yeah.
If you could pick one backpacking meal or one kind of backpacking snack to eat every day on every trip, what would it be?
M&Ms.
M&Ms. All right. M&Ms is your go-to backpacking food?
I just love chocolate above pretty much all other foods, so...
I was going to ask you what was your longest or hardest hiking day ever, but was this it, or has there been another one?
The other one is when we tried to do Mount Diablo all the way to the top and back in one day.
Oh, yeah.
That one, it was a little less mileage, but harder on my ankles, I remember.
Yeah, that was tough. And you had decided to do it in hiking sandals, which are pretty good for most things, but it was that second half of that hike all the way downhill. That was a tough place to be wearing sandals.
Definitely.
All right. One more question.
All right.
What's the worst night of sleep you ever got while you were backpacking?
The worst night of sleep I've ever gotten in an outdoor sort of situation was actually at a camp that I was going to. Usually when I backpack, I sleep for 2 hours, turn over, sleep for 2 more hours, turn over, sleep for 2 more hours, and then it's time to get up. But I remember when I was at camp doing a overnight backpacking thing, it was really hard to sleep just from being teenagers and
yeah. So you got basically no sleep that night?
Pretty much. That makes backpacking a little bit harder.
It's funny that you mentioned the getting 2 hours and then turning over, because that is exactly how it goes a lot of the time with backpacking sleep. And I remember one guy who I met on a trail somewhere said, yeah, backpacking, you don't really sleep. You kind of have a series of naps.
I would agree with that. But, at least you're getting some downtime.
Yeah. And what I found, though, is if you're on longer hikes, I've found that eventually my body will give me a full night's sleep. But it does take a while to get used to the outdoors and to get used to the sleeping pads and that kind of thing.
That makes sense.
All right, Sonia. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thanks for having me.
So I hope that this episode has inspired you to hike the Benson Lake Loop. Keep in mind that this podcast is entertainment and meant to spark your interest. If you decide to hike the trail, do your own research. Like anything else worth doing, outdoor adventure has risk. So when you go, pack your common sense, and when you get back, tell me how it went. If you have any questions or feedback on this episode, or any ideas for future episodes, including if you want to be a guest on the show and talk about a trail that you've hiked, please reach out to me at trailsworthhiking@gmail.com. Couple more things before we go. One, I want to remind you about Outdoor Herbivore at outdoorherbivore.com. Outdoor Herbivore has great vegetarian and vegan backpacking meals. But as I've said in the past, you don't need to be a vegetarian or a vegan to love them. They are made with quality ingredients. There's a great selection of possible backpacking meals. They're tasty. They are in boil-in-the-bag packaging so that you can prepare them easily just by pouring hot water into the bag and sealing it. And best of all, Trails Worth Hiking listeners get 10% off with the discount code TWH10P. That's Trails Worth Hiking 10%. So go to outdoorherbivore.com and check them out and start buying backpacking meals for the upcoming spring and summer backpacking season. And finally, let's talk about our next episode. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we describe a trail that brings you up close to a volcanic mountain landscape, dotted with ancient lava flows, serene lakes, beautiful cascades, and deep forests where, if you are lucky, you might be able to catch a glimpse of Bigfoot. The trail traverses an almost 50-mile or about 80-kilometer loop that traces an oval around 3 imposing stratovolcanoes, each of which rises more than 10,000 feet above sea level. The volcanoes are called the Three Sisters. One of them may only be sleeping and could wake again someday. Next time on Trails Worth Hiking, we travel the Three Sisters Loop in the Cascade Mountains in Central Oregon. All right, so that does it for this episode. So start planning your next hike, and before you know it, you'll be on the trail. Thanks for listening.